about industrial change in Britain circa 1700 to 1850. The first section will show you how people lived up until 1750, the pattern of industry there and an urban society at that time. We will look at agriculture in the early 18th century and how it supported industrialisation in the latter half of the 18th century. We will see how the Enclosure Acts helped change Britain from a rural society to an urban one. We'll look at what kind of innovations and inventions in industry were there during this period, iron and coal, and why they were important. The presentation will then look at causes and nature of industrial change in Britain, transport, textiles and steam power during 1760 to 1850. Finally, this presentation will look at the impact on economic and political life, what the economy was like in 1700 compared to 1850, the Acts of Parliament, and how did urbanisation create a class society. Around the 1700s to 1760, most people were living in agrarian societies, living and working on the land. 80% of the 6 million people were engaged in farming for survival. The sketch of the typical farmer shows how life moved at a very slow pace and had done so for many centuries, as the fastest transport was by horse and cart or by horse alone. In 1536 and 1539, King Henry VIII had broken up the church and firstly closed most of the small monasteries and then the larger ones, taking away their lands and giving them to the gentry who farmed them. He also stole a lot of the church as well, but that is for a history presentation. Much of the land became communal after this, with the gentry allowing the people to graze their animals on the strips between the fields and any unused land. Farmers collectively grazed their own livestock as well as planting their crops on these small pieces of land. However, the Enclosure Acts between 17 to 1800s allowed land that belonged to landowners, generally the wealthy, to be fenced and effectively were now closed to the general public, which they had used for centuries as free pasture and free grazing based on the medieval strip system. The land strips that had been between the owner's land was now ring-fenced with hedges and fences. With the land now closed off, this prevented the non-landowners from grazing their animals and growing their crops and their ability to survive, so the people began moving towards the towns looking for work. This increased population to the towns created a new workforce of people to fill the factories that were beginning to be developed in the textile industry, which was undergoing major changes to its productions. Britain was now in need of more food as the population was now growing, and so new ideas and machines were being developed. These now larger plots of land enabled the seed drill, which had been further refined by Jethro Tull, to be used more effectively, and his ideas helped modernise Britain's agriculture. The seed drill could plant seeds in straight lines as well as digging the hole at the same time and positioning them in the soil. This era from 1650 to 1750 was known as the Second Agricultural Revolution. It enabled greater food production at lower prices as labour was being saved by using new machinery. Full crop rotation was experimented with by the wealthy landowners and encouraged growth of legumes like peas and beans, wheat, barley, clover and turnips. Instead of fields lying fallow for 1 or 2 years to refresh the soil, using different crops each year gave greater fertility to the soil, gaining new minerals and nutrients, reducing soil erosion, increasing crop yield, which increased food production massively, particularly the clover, helping enrich the fodder for the animals, which in turn produced richer manure to enable better crop growth. Britain also had already in place a patent system which protected an invention from being replicated, thus enabling industrial entrepreneurs and inventors to take financial risks in getting them backed. Patent agents and patent protections gave rights to inventors of their inventions. Thomas Savery's first steam power water pump was the first patent of this era in 1698. It could raise water 26 to 28 feet vertically from coal mines. The importance of the pumps was that it allowed water to be pumped safely from coal mines, enabling people to go deeper and further into the mines with less risk to life. It was in textiles, though, that the biggest changes were happening. Innovations, new ideas, new inventions changed the face of textiles forever. However, in this period, the textile industry was still unregulated, leading to inefficiencies in products and different standards at the beginning of this century. Up until the early 1700s, textiles was a small localised industry within the local villages, where merchants would come and buy the products and sell them in other villages. So small cottage industries began to develop. But again, these involved only a few people at a time, with their own spinning wheels and small weaving machine. During this period, many new ideas were coming from entrepreneurs and inventors. Britain was a small population, but it was a colonial power and needed labour-saving devices to operate its wealth and labour forces. Very importantly, it was a source of raw materials. Talking about Britain's colonial power, they served as markets for the developing industries of textile and coal. So why did the Industrial Revolution develop first in Britain? We had many advantages over other cultures, which could be one of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain as rapidly and as largely as it did. However, the huge resources of natural minerals like coal and iron were in abundance and therefore cheap. But it was really the steam engine that revolutionised Britain. Steve Newcomen's steam engine changed the face of Britain. It was by far the most successful steam engine invented. With water being able to be cleared from the mines, there was now more coal for power, and this power was used for more steam engines, leading to the development of the steam engine by James Watts, who made an engine possible for steamboats, but also ever more efficient cotton mills, but I will get to that later. So in summary, the pattern of industry in urban society in this period was that there was a stable government, there was an abundance of raw materials, a working and functioning patent system, silver had a high value, wages were high, life was slow but speeding up, inventions were being created, jobs were being mechanised, and the steam engine had been invented. Causes and nature of industrial change in Britain circa 1760 to 1850. Contributing to the development of the Industrial Revolution was the increase in production brought about by the use of machines and characterised by the use of new energy sources like steam. Whilst it first started in Britain and spread across Europe, it really started in the textile industry by the inventions of new textile-style machines, triggering manufactured goods and mass production with the inventions made. Textiles, agriculture, coal mining, transportation, iron making and other natural resources, as well as many others, were making changes and advances to their production. But the biggest accomplishment by far was the contribution of the machine's ability to accomplish a task. Industrialisation is the process of an economy moving from an agrarian society and an agricultural economy which depends on agriculture to one of manufacturing goods and creating mass production of goods, and this was happening and speeding up in the early 1700s. For example, steam engines, the first steam engine invented by Steve Newcomen in 1712, pumped and extracted water from coal mines far more efficiently than the Thomas Avery pump. Due to the improved safety of the miners, they're able to go even deeper into the mines and have a much greater coal production. However, it was still fairly inefficient. Further improvements were made over the years until James Watt, 1770s, made steam engines efficient. By understanding that in previous inventions steam expanded and condensed in one location, but with his own science knowledge, he separated the two processes. With steam engine improvement over the years from 1760, over 2,000 steam engines were in production by the 1800s, powering the factories, powering shipping, pumping and railway industry, enabling faster travel. Inventions like the spinning jenny, which was invented by James Hargreaves in 1767, enabled spinning in the textiles industry to increase threefold. One spinner or one spinning machine would normally produce one yarn, but the spinning jenny enabled 8 threads of yarn to be made per spinner. The repercussions of this was that 3 spinners could now keep up with the weavers. The flying shuttle was invented in 1773 by John Kay, which allowed one weaver to produce more fabric and wider fabric than more weavers could possibly do, and now the weavers could keep up with the spinners. The picture here shows Richard Arkwright's spinning water frame, which was patented in 1769 and immediately brought into use. It was a spinning water frame that completely changed the face of textiles. Due to the steam engines and water power, it was able to spin 128 threads in a mechanised way with little personal interaction. This meant larger factories had to be built to keep up with production. People began moving away from their villages to these new areas, and industry in new villages grew around these new styles of factories. Whole families worked in these factories, including the children. It didn't take long for these processes to become mechanised, not just using the power of water, but using steam engines to make the shuttles move incredibly fast in the ever-growing huge cotton mills. Eventually, factories did not have to rely on rivers anymore for their water wheels because they could use steam engines to power their factories, and now these factories moved into the towns. Due to this invention, for the very first time in living history, there was a power that could run a machine other than a human. He became known as the father of the Industrial Revolution. The impact of industrial change was beginning to be visible. Prosperity was growing and products were being mass-produced by machines on increasingly larger scales as opposed to by hand. Iron. Pure iron ore is extracted from a rock or mineral, and this can be done profitably. This was then used to make steel, which was then used for the railways in the 1700s. Coking coal, with its high energy value, was made to strengthen steel. Interestingly, coking coal was made from coal, which was heated in an oxygen-starved condition, ridding the coal of water and other organic chemicals which made the coke volatile. Coals versus coke. Even though coal burns hotter than coke, it is coke that is purified and is therefore more efficient, and it burns slower and therefore longer than coal does. Because of this, pig iron output also increased during this period from 27,000 tonnes to 2,250,000 tonnes. With the improvement and development of the road system and the steel industry allowing the railways to develop, it was easier to transport goods more quickly and efficiently around the country. However, roads in the first half of the century had been rough and unmade. They were dirt tracks, turning muddy and dangerous to navigate in the winter, and rock hard in the summer. They were difficult to travel on, especially with produce. In 1663, the first Turnpike, the Great North Road between Hertfordshire and Huntingdonshire. These were tolls with an authorised levy collected, and this was used for maintaining and further building of the roads. The roads were further divided up and rented to turnpike trusts, which made road improvements in return for a toll or a levy. By 1836, all roads leading from London were turnpiked, 1/5 of all roads were turnpiked, and there were 942 new turnpike acts. Transport in Britain was growing not just to move produce and manufactured goods around, but also for social reasons. Rivers had been used for centuries, navigable rivers like the Thames, to move goods around. You can see on the graph, however, that when the roads were turnpiked, transport on the roads increased dramatically during this period. Canals were built around 1750 to transport goods as well, and these were a large part of the transport system in Britain. Railways took longer to develop, as the first locomotive only really came into function in the early 1800s. Islamabad, British civil and mechanical engineer, he designed and constructed railway lines, tunnels, docks, bridges and steamboats. He was particularly noted for the Clifton Suspension Bridge over the Avon Gorge. The Great Western Sea Ship, which was a wooden paddle, was the first ever transatlantic steamship and had the first regular transatlantic service. Brunel then later went on and designed two further ships, the Great Britain and the Great Eastern, which had a double iron hull and a screw propeller. All this was possible with the advent of mining coal more easily and in greater quantities, and being able to make steel, and made it possible for transatlantic travel, enabling produce to be transported all over the world. In summary, financial institutions were already in place like the central bank, which was able to finance new ideas, and due to the booming cotton industry, thanks to slavery and really not a proud time in Britain's history, this new trade enabled the banks to lend money and finance new ideas, supporting entrepreneurs in the constructions of factories. These entrepreneurs were interested in taking risks to make profit and were leading the way forward in industrialisation. The rate of economic growth from the mid-18th century in England increased significantly, sustaining the Industrial Revolution. There was an increase in demand for everything that was being made. Due to the population growth, there was also an increase in demand for products of industrial and agricultural type. Britain had massive mineral sources, our boats could transport our products to foreign markets, and our colonial empire was a ready-made market for our manufactured goods, and we had the technology. The impact of industrial change on the British social, economic and political life by 1850 was so enormous that it was called the Revolution. In 1700, as many as 80% of the population was living on the land with little money and no possibility to have what was effectively in their own backyard. By 1850, there was more than a 200% increase in population growth, the majority now living in the towns. Large numbers of people working in factories and discovering they have similar social attitudes and a common economic position. This became known as the working class. The figures describe how much social change had occurred. Male employment in agriculture decreased in 1840 by 53%. However, the employment of males in industry in 1840 increased by 60%. The urban population grew from 17% to 48.3%, which was an increase of 64%. This new working class of people lived closely together in the towns. In those times, they were the slums. These are the people who sell their labour for financial reward and identify themselves as such, non-owners of the businesses and the profits they make for their bosses. However, before the end of the 1700s, industrialists and entrepreneurs had to live near their businesses, but with the labouring sorts moving in as well, the wealthier people began moving out to the greener and leafier areas where the air was fresher, and they formed the suburbs, unwittingly creating a middle class with similar social standing and backgrounds. There was a conflict of interest between these two classes, with different reactions towards their own interests. Whilst urbanisation made life good for many, it also produced problems like insanitary working conditions and poor living conditions like slums. Children were being injured in the factories and the dangerous machinery had no safeguards. Industrial rioting and protesting started as people began to fight for their rights to live as respected human beings. In response to these demands and these changes in behaviour of the labouring type now recognised as the working class, the government made many new acts. The Gilberts Act 1782 encouraged the wealthier in giving relief to the poor. Parishes were able to form unions to share the cost of the poor through the poorhouses. Landowner and other employers received allowances from the parish so that they could raise wages for their workers up to subsistence levels, encouraging the gentry and the wealthier in giving assistance to the poor. In 1833, the Factory Act became law. Children under 9 could not be employed and children under 12 had restrictive working hours. No children were allowed to work at night. The Combination Act was workers were putting pressure on employers for better hours, and pay, so the Prime Minister William Pitt made this act to prevent workers joining tighter as a union. This made it difficult to strike. Fortunately, this act was repealed in 1824, but then it was followed by the Combinations and Workmen's Act 1825, but again this was imposing limitations on striking. Poor Law 1834. This law was to put off poor people looking for relief. Victorian values looked at deserving and undeserving, making decisions that are actually not so different to today's values, where the disabled are made to look like pariahs on society, as well as those who are uneducated and unemployed. Back then, relief was given through workhouses for the widows, orphans and disabled, who were deemed slightly more acceptable than those simply out of work. In 1839, Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish philosopher and writer, wrote, "The new poor law is an announcement that whosoever will not work ought not to live. Can the poor man that is willing to work always find work and live by his work? A man willing but unable to find work is the saddest thing under the sun." The Public Health Act 1848 was based on protecting the public health, so there would be less people looking for poor relief. Edwin Chadwick, who assisted in the making of the Poor Law, found a link between poor sanitation and workers' health with the spread of diseases. He got the government to enact the Public Health Act, which concerned itself with clean drinking water, supplies, improved drainage and sewerage, refuse removal from streets and houses, and environmental health regulation. The Reform Act 1832 removed the opportunities for rotten boroughs. This was where a borough had only a handful of people, but actually maybe a couple of MPs. And Parliament then created 67 new constituencies, but managed to officially exclude women from voting. It did allow householders who paid the £10 yearly fee to vote, but this excluded the working man who could not afford to pay and were not landowners. Yet it showed that reform was possible and pointed the way for future reforms. Mines and Collieries Act 1842, also known as the Mines Act, prohibited all women and girls to work underground and boys younger than 10. Still, by 1870, over 1,000 lives were lost each year due to accidents. Trade unions, today nationally, they look after the interests of workers, helping to negotiate on agreements with employers, for example, on working conditions and pay, as well as regulating the relationships between the workers and the employer. These started in the 17th century, where local workers grouped together taking collective actions as safety standards were non-existent and wages were low, so it was only natural that workers joined as a combination. The best way to get attention was to strike, which did not help the factory output and hurt the investors, many of whom formed the government, as only landowners and businessmen could be in politics. Despite this, the unions grew in numbers and became national. John Doherty helped form the General Union of Trades in 1830, which eventually became the TUC, and which helped form the Labour Party in 1900. The General Union of Trades brought together trade unionists from other small groups into a national organisation to give support for those involved in industrial disputes. Trade union membership rose from approximately 100,000 to around 1 million due to the improved economic and conditions of its workers that the unions accomplished. Although these unions were growing in numbers, for a short period they were overshadowed by political movements like Chartism. Chartism was a working class movement to concede manhood suffrage. All men, males, were not considered equal to each other. It asked for all men over the age of 21, including working men, to have the vote, and this should be by secret ballot. It also called for the abolition of the qualification that one had to be a landowner to become a member of Parliament. It was also asking for equal size electoral districts and annual elections of Parliament. By the 1850s, further Reform Acts were passed. The Second Reform Act allowed men in boroughs to vote, but still had to qualify under certain property qualifications, and this succeeded in increasing the electorate from 1.43 million to 2.5 million, because it now allowed people who rented property to vote as well as those owning property. The Third Reform Act, 1884, extended this right to men in the counties. In 1871, trade unions were legalised in the UK as advantages were recognised for collective bargaining with employers and employees. At the same time, the Tolpuddle Martyrs were a group of 6 agricultural labourers from Dorset who were found guilty of swearing an oath to protect their wages, and they were sentenced to a life as criminals in Australia. This triggered public riots throughout Britain. Eventually they were pardoned and the men came home after 3 years. What this shows us is how public life had changed from the slow-moving pace of the early 1700s, with little connection between the villagers living on the land, to urban living, industrialisation, and people of similar social and economic backgrounds like the working class living and working together, usually in such appalling conditions that they had to stand up and fight for their rights of a decent, healthy and safe existence. Class consciousness arose from the Industrial Revolution. These were the people who were labourers, around 80% of the population in the early 1700s, living dispersed in their villages with little expectations on life. Because of urbanisation and people living together, the class consciousness arose and gave rise to the working class. It took until 6 February 1918 to allow all men, including working men, to vote. Women could vote over the age of 30, but only with certain property requirements. It took until 1928 for all women to get the vote on the same basis as men over the age of 21. The end. Presented by Michaelina Orji.